Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in the history of Appalachia. We'll explore what happened in West Virginia in 1821, when the mountains were a place of secrets that no one dared to tell. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're watching and whether you've heard of this area's sinister mysteries. West Virginia was not yet a distinct state in the early 19th century. Communities lived in this mountainous area that was a part of Virginia. Narrow trails that meandered through deep valleys and dense forests were the only means of connection between the isolated Appalachian peaks. Those mountains were especially hardy during the winter of 1820. For months, the trails were covered in snow, and families had to rely on supplies that had been stored from the previous fall. There were no railroads, telegraphs, or other quick ways to communicate back then. Word of mouth spread slowly through horse couriers and itinerant traders, among Greenbrier County's most. There was a small community of about 40 families in isolated areas of the Appalachians. A few decades prior, they had arrived as hunters, loggers, and farmers, looking for fertile land in the valleys between the mountains. Although life was difficult, people knew one another, trusted one another, and helped one another out when things got tough. The community was centered around a log church, a tavern that served as a gathering spot, and a general store where locals exchanged tools for animal hides, salt, and textiles. Something started to shift in that sleepy community in the fall of 1820. Initially, the market's women were only whispering to one another. Then, strangers approached and cut off conversations. Children were not allowed to play alone in the woods, and men started to look at one another suspiciously in the tavern. Although there was no open discussion of what was going on, everyone knew that something was seriously wrong. Strange tales have long been associated with the Appalachian region. The mountains were ancient, far older than any human civilization on the continent, and the indigenous peoples who lived there before European settlers talked about places to stay away from, like seemingly endless deep caverns, valleys with oddly echoing sounds, and parts of the forest that animals wouldn't go. These tales were initially written off by the settlers as archaic superstition. However, as the years went by, many people started to see that maybe these old stories had some truth to them. November 1820 saw on the mountain's north slope, a farmer named Thomas Whitmore was checking his traps when he came across something that stopped him cold. They were odd markings etched into the nearby trees, rather than creatures that had fallen into his traps. They were symbols he had never seen before, created with a sharp instrument, most likely an axe or knife. The exposed wood was still pale and damp with sap, and the marks were new. This deeply troubled Thomas, who was a pragmatic man who was not prone to fantasy. After gathering his traps, he went down the mountain, quicker than normal. The local church reverend was silent for a considerable amount of time after Thomas told him about what he had discovered. He then requested that Thomas keep the symbols a secret from other people. He said that these were issues that should not be discussed in public because they might unnecessarily panic people. Thomas obeyed, but his discomfort kept getting worse. Other locals started reporting odd occurrences in the days that followed, including tools that vanished overnight and reappeared in different locations. After dark, there were sounds coming from the forest like voices singing in a language they didn't know. Farm animals that had not been attacked were discovered dead. Early in the year, winter arrived. The valleys were already covered in snow by December, making the trails all but impossible. Around this time, the first person vanished. One gloomy morning, 17-year-old Sarah McKinley went out to get water from the nearby stream. She wore a thick green woolen shawl and carried 2 wooden buckets. Her mother observed her departure via the window in the kitchen. Sarah never came back. The water in the buckets was already starting to freeze when they were discovered abandoned on the bank of the stream. Other than Sarah's footprints, there were no indications of a struggle. There was nothing to show what had occurred. Search parties were promptly organized by the community. For 3 days, dozens of men searched the forest, calling Sarah's name and following every trail they could find. All they could find was silence. Any hints that remained were obscured by the snow that kept falling. On the 4th day, the men came back tired and defeated. Despite the fact that there was no body to bury, the McKinley family grieved. Everyone at the church prayed for the young woman's soul to find peace during the memorial service led by the pastor. However, that was only the start. 2 more individuals vanished under similar circumstances in January of 1821. A seasoned hunter who was intimately familiar with these mountains went out to check traps and never came back. A few days later, an elderly woman living alone on the say, there was just no sign of the community's edge. She was gone, but her house was still there, the door locked from the inside. It seemed as though people were being wiped out, leaving only uncertainty and terror in their wake. That remote community was engulfed in terror. As soon as the sun started to set, families locked themselves inside their houses. Even during the day, nobody went out by themselves anymore. The tavern was empty. There were fewer church services. People whispered to each other and constantly glanced over their shoulders as though something, perhaps invisible, is observing. Maybe it was. The community of Greenbrier County was engulfed in a heavy silence as the winter of 1821 deepened over the Appalachian Mountains. In some places, the accumulated snow was knee-deep, turning the entire world into a silent, white expanse that seemed to engulf all sound. Even in homes with fireplaces, the bitter cold reached the bone, and the bare trees stretched their branches like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. In this setting, locals started to observe an unsettling trend in the disappearances. Although initially unnoticed, all of the missing individuals shared a common trait. Days prior to their disappearance, Sarah McKinley, Hunter Benjamin Foster, and Mrs. Martha Green had all reported seeing something odd in the woods. At dusk, Sarah reported to her younger sister that she noticed a pale light moving through the trees. Benjamin told his wife that he noticed strange footprints in the snow that were too big to be bare footprints. He was unable to recognize the pattern. Martha reported to her neighbor that she had heard knocking on her home's exterior wall for 3 nights in a row, always at the same time and with the same rhythm. A collective shiver went through the community when this information eventually came to light and was whispered nervously among the residents. For the first time in weeks, so many people had gathered in one location when Reverend Samuel Porter called a meeting at the church. That January evening, the wooden church was crowded. Families crammed into. Candles flickered in the pews, creating dancing shadows on the walls. With an expression marked with anxiety and the weight of something that was obviously tormenting him, the Reverend took the pulpit. He started off by declaring that it was time to make public some facts that had been suppressed for far too long. The congregation's attentive silence reverberated with his voice. The Reverend claimed that the older locals had alerted him to certain locations in the area when he first arrived here 15 years prior. Mountains that ought not to be disturbed. They mentioned a particular place, a deep valley about 3 miles north, where old trees grew crookedly and the air was consistently cooler, even in the summer. The local indigenous population at the time gave the location a name that meant Forbidden Valley, or land where the spirits do not sleep. The Reverend acknowledged that he had written it off for years as local folklore, made up stories to frighten kids. However, in recent months he had started to discover unsettling proof. Thomas Whitmore noticed that some of the symbols he saw on the trees had also subtly surfaced elsewhere. Tiny, nearly undetectable inscriptions etched on stones, gates, and fences close to the residences of individuals who subsequently vanished. The Reverend had looked through his old books to see what these symbols meant, but he had not found anything. They didn't appear to be part of any recognized writing system or language. The church was immediately rocked by the revelation. Voices rose in confusion, fear, and protest. What was the reason behind the Reverend's secrecy? Why hadn't he warned the locals earlier? Raising his hands in a gesture of calm, he clarified that he didn't want to incite fear until he was certain of the situation. But now that 3 people were missing and the pattern was emerging, he could not keep quiet any longer. They had to take action because there was something going on in those mountains that was beyond normal comprehension. Jacob Turner, an elderly rancher who had resided there for more than 30 years, stood up slowly. He started speaking in a hoarse arrow voice that seemed to be heavy with years of secrets kept hidden. Jacob claimed to have heard tales about this forbidden valley from his own father before he passed away. The indigenous peoples used this region for specific rituals long before European settlers arrived. These were not your typical rituals. Rather, they were sinister ceremonies that included customs that the nearby tribes deemed hazardous and obscene. Jacob claims that his dad had only once, decades ago, ventured into that valley out of curiosity. He was profoundly affected by what he discovered there. There were old stone buildings that were stacked in odd shapes and partially covered by vegetation. There was a circular clearing in the middle of the valley where the grass refused to grow, leaving only dark, desolate earth. On the rock walls surrounding this clearing were paintings that had deteriorated over time, unsettling depictions of figures that didn't seem fully human. The father of Jacob had vowed never to make his son swear not to go back there either. However, as the disappearances persisted, Jacob questioned whether something had awakened in that valley. Maybe an inquisitive adventurer had agitated something that ought to be quiet. Or maybe, and this was an even more terrifying possibility, some members of the community were aware of this location and were making sinister use of their knowledge. Hours were spent at the church meeting. Fears were expressed, theories were debated, and gradually a plan took shape. A team. As soon as the weather allowed, a group of 12 volunteers would be assembled to explore the Forbidden Valley. In addition to bringing weapons and supplies, they would thoroughly map the area in an effort to find any indication of the missing individuals or proof of the possible cause of these horrible occurrences. The mission was risky. Everyone was aware of that. The fear of doing nothing, however, was even more intense. The Reverend, meanwhile, advised all families to exercise caution. Nobody ought to go out by themselves. At nightfall, all homes should be locked, and strange things should be reported right away. Additionally, he exhorted everyone to search their property for these enigmatic symbols. Anyone who discovers the marks should notify others right away. Maybe there was a pattern to who was being marked, a way to figure out who would be the next to be targeted, he thought. That evening, the congregation departed the church in a state of both fear and resolve. The darkness between the houses seemed thicker than usual, and the moon was obscured by thick clouds. Families strolled, carrying lanterns that cast tiny circles of flickering light in the snow. They hurried to their homes. The crunch of snow beneath their boots and the chilly wind rustling through the pines were the only sounds to break the stillness. The community started a thorough search for those enigmatic symbols over the course of the following few days. What they discovered was even more unsettling than they had anticipated. There were marks all over. Like an unseen web, dozens of them dispersed throughout the region. Many were in locations that people visited on a daily basis, but had never noticed, concealed in obscure corners and blended in with the stones or wood's organic texture. It seemed as though someone or something was systematically and purposefully marking territory throughout the entire community. Then came the revelation that made all the difference. Emily Patterson, 10, saw something odd on one of the ceiling beams while she was assisting her mother in gathering firewood from the barn. As she ascended a ladder for a closer view, she discovered not only the recognizable symbols, but with a twist. A tiny item, resembling a primitive doll, was subtly suspended between the beams. It was composed of twigs bound together with plant fibers. A lock of blonde hair, which Emily recognized right away, was fastened to this figure. Sarah McKinley's, the first young woman to go missing, had the same shade. An icy gale of terror swept through the community after the discovery in the Patterson family barn. When Emily's mother saw the ominous item, she felt her legs weaken as she hung from the rafters. Screaming for her husband, who was working in the nearby field, she fled the barn while holding her daughter close. In a matter of minutes, a number of neighbors had gathered around the wooden structure, gazing at the small figure bound with twigs with a mixture of fascination and horror. At first, no one dared to touch the object. Everyone seemed to have an innate sense that it contained something malevolent, a sinister purpose that was discernible even from a distance. The Reverend. An hour later, Samuel Porter was called in and rode swiftly through the snow that was starting to melt as a rare sunny day arrived. Muttering prayers to himself, he ascended the stairs slowly and studied the figure intently without touching it. When he verified that the blonde hair did indeed seem human, his face became even paler. The Reverend removed the item with trembling hands and covered it with a thick cloth. He gave the order to search all barns, stables, and outbuildings within the neighborhood. There may be more of these items out there if the Patterson barn had one. And maybe they could figure out who would be the next victim before it was too late if each one was marked with a particular person's hair or possessions. The search started right away. Every building, every hidden space, every beam, every dark corner was searched by groups of 4 or 5 people. And their worst fears were validated by what they discovered. At 5 additional attributes, comparable items were found, all concealed in high, difficult-to-see locations, as though the person who put them there knew exactly where no one would look. Every rudimentary figure had an accessory: a strand of hair, a piece of fabric, or, in one instance, a tiny length of rope that someone identified as a component of a belt Benjamin Foster once wore. The fact that not all of these numbers matched individuals who had already vanished was the most horrifying aspect. 3 of them belonged to living residents. The farmer Thomas Whitmore was the first to discover these. Among them were the symbols on the trees. When his wife saw a button from her favorite shirt on one of the figures in her own barn, she almost passed out. The other 2 were Henry Wallace, an elderly blacksmith, and Rebecca Collins, a young mother. Now the community had to deal with a horrible reality. People were being specifically targeted by something or someone with a malevolent intent. These were not unplanned forest mishaps or attacks by untamed animals. This was organized, methodical, and carried out by a person who was well acquainted with the neighborhood and its customs. The question was straightforward but devastating, and everyone was asking it in whispers so as not to be overheard. Who among them might be acting in this way? That little mountain community started to erode the trust that had served as its cornerstone. After years of meal sharing and mutual assistance, neighbors now viewed one another with suspicion. Suspicions were raised by every odd gesture, inexplicable absence, and misspoken word. Families grew even more. Isolated, avoiding contact with other residents, refusing visitors, and locking their doors even during the day. Reverend Porter suggested that the 3 individuals identified by the remaining figures be under continual guard. Henry Wallace, Rebecca Collins, and Thomas Whitmore were brought to the church, where they would be watched over by shifts of armed men day and night. They would run into opposition if anything or anyone came for them. The wooden church was converted into a sort of temporary fortress with the main door constantly guarded and all the windows closed and locked. Nothing happened for 3 days. The wait was unbearable. Inside the church, Thomas, Rebecca, and Henry tried to maintain their composure, prayed, and spoke softly about better times. With rifles loaded and sharp knives fastened to their belts, the guards outside remained vigilant. Some men started to wonder if all this precaution was really necessary. Maybe the figures were just a cruel attempt to frighten the locals. Maybe whoever had made them flee somewhere else and had already left. However, something occurred on the third night, in the gloomiest hours before sunrise, which disproved their theory. A young man named Michael Hayes, one of the guards, was circling the church when he heard a noise emanating from the woods nearby. He couldn't understand the low, barely audible chant, which sounded like voices whispering in unison. Every hair on Michael's body stood on end. He called out to the other guards while holding his rifle close to his chest. 4. He was joined by tense, armed men. The chanting persisted, resonating through the trees in a manner that defied logic and appearing to originate from multiple directions simultaneously. Then the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. Even more unnerving was the silence that ensued. The men stood there waiting, barely breathing. Hours elapsed in minutes. At that moment, Michael saw something in the snow near the forest's edge. They were footprints, but not your typical footprints. They were big, extremely big, with a strange shape that didn't fit any animal he was familiar with. The most peculiar aspect of all was that they appeared out of nowhere, as though the source had just materialized in the middle of the clearing. As though someone had been observing, researching, or making plans, the footprints created a circle around the church, always staying at the same distance. The guards' flashlights flickered as they followed the footprints. After making a full circle around the church, the trail headed back into the forest and abruptly vanished next to an old GNLE'd tree. The trail did not continue onto the opposite side of the tree. Beyond that, there are no marks in the snow. Whatever had left those footprints seemed to have just vanished from existence there. The news of what had transpired during the night was met with a growing sense of despair by the community when the sun finally rose that morning, turning the mountains orange and pink. If maintaining that presence within a sacred site required more than just group protection, what else could they do at bay? Some started discussing leaving the area entirely, packing what they could carry, and moving to bigger, denser towns where they might be safe. Others countered that fleeing would not resolve the issue. The trails were hazardous, winter was still raging, and elderly people and whole families with small children would not be able to endure a lengthy hike through the mountains in these circumstances. Furthermore, who could ensure that whatever it was wouldn't come next? Them? Almost imperceptibly, the disappearances had started out quietly. People could be bringing down entire communities by sharing their nightmare if it could spread and follow them to other locations. It was during this most hopeless time that a stranger entered the community. Wearing shabby travel clothes and carrying only an old backpack, he rode along the southern trail on horseback. There was something in his eyes that suggested he had witnessed things most people would never see, and his face was extremely worn. He introduced himself as Daniel Crowley, a man who had traveled the Appalachian region for years, researching the region's lost sites, ancient histories, and hidden mysteries. Daniel claimed that a trader who had traveled through Greenbrier County weeks earlier had told him about the odd happenings there. He was intrigued by these rumors because he had heard similar tales from other mountain locations. Things that had happened decades or even centuries ago consistently followed the same patterns. He offered his assistance, his information about these remote regions and their secrets in return for nothing more than food and shelter. At first, Daniel was viewed suspiciously by the community, After all, it was suspicious, to put it mildly, for a stranger to show up at a time when horrible things were occurring. However, after having a lengthy conversation with the traveler, Reverend Porter felt he was sincere. Daniel had a serious demeanor, a profound awareness of forces that others would rather overlook, and they were in dire need of assistance at that precise moment. Daniel. The 3 marked residents were still under guard when Crowley was brought to the church. He carefully held each of the twig figures he had discovered, examining the knots in the plant fibers and feeling the material's texture. As he worked, his expression stayed solemn, and occasionally he muttered to himself, seemingly to confirm preconceived notions. After completing his analysis, he requested to see the tree's symbols, and the places where the odd footprints were found had been located. As he moved through the snow, which was starting to soften with the first indications that winter might be ending, the community silently followed him. Before every symbol, Daniel paused, tilting his head as though he were hearing something that no one else could hear, and traced the lines with his fingers without actually touching them. He knelt in the snow and stood still for several minutes, just watching, when they arrived at the spot where the circular footprints were around the church. At last, when they came back, Daniel told the church what he knew. His tone was solemn but serene. He clarified that the origins of these symbols and customs can be traced back to ancient rituals that predated even the native peoples that the majority of the settlers were familiar with. They were relics of customs from a bygone era when these mountains were home to various ethnic groups that engaged in spiritual practices deemed dangerous and prohibited by other tribes. Daniel claims that these customs included the notion that specific mountain locations were thresholds and portals that separate the outside world from the visible world. One such location was the Forbidden Valley Jacob Turner had described. According to the old tales, it was possible to negotiate with forces that were not fully of this world in these locations, trading valuables for influence, wisdom, or favors. However, there was always a cost associated with these agreements, and those costs typically included human lives. Daniel clarified that the twig figures were an old method of ritual marking. In essence, those who made them were providing the marked people in exchange for something they wanted or had already received. In order to create a sacred area where rituals could be carried out, the symbols on trees and the property were used to delimit territory. Additionally, the odd footprints, those unbelievable marks in the snow, were proof that something on the other side was responding to the call and that the agreement had been accepted. There was complete silence in the room as everyone took in this information. It was hard to believe. It contradicted all they had discovered about how the world functioned. However, there was also no rational reason for what they were going through. People didn't just disappear into thin air. The dark chant the guards heard was not coming from ordinary human throats, and footprints did not suddenly appear and stop in the middle. The young mother, among the marked Rebecca Collins, trembled as she asked what they could do. Was there a way to reverse this ritual agreement, if it existed at all? Daniel gave a slow shake of his head. He said that it was very risky to interrupt a ritual of this kind that was already underway. Forces beyond human understanding had already been activated, and whoever had started this process was devoted to it. Stopping it now might have even more dire repercussions. However, he went on, there was a chance, if a dangerous one. At a particular point in the ritual, if they could locate the person performing the rites and confront them at the holy location in the Forbidden Valley, it might be conceivable to violate the contract. It wouldn't be simple or safe, but it was the only way he knew to save the 3 marked individuals who were still alive, as well as possibly retrieve the others who had vanished, if they were still alive. The word living reverberated throughout the space. Everyone was thinking about what had happened to Martha Green, Benjamin Foster, and Sarah McKinley, but no one had the courage to say it out loud. Were they really dead? Or was there a worse situation? A few states, some prison from which they were unable to escape between life and death. According to the old tales Daniel was familiar with, individuals were held as living sacrifices, their essence gradually being sapped over the course of months or even years. Reverend Porter came to a conclusion. To reach the Forbidden Valley, they would organize an expedition. Under the leadership of Daniel Crowley and Jacob Turner, who at least knew the general location of the location, it would be made up of the strongest and bravest men in the community. They would carry ropes, lanterns, provisions, weapons, and anything else they might require. Additionally, they would steal holy items, Bibles, crosses, holy water, and anything else that the Christian faith provided as defense against evil. Daniel gave the 3 marked individuals instructions to stay in the church under close observation while preparations were being made. In contrast to the symbols they had discovered, he hung particular herbs in the windows and made protective circles out of salt around their sleeping quarters, these purportedly shielding. He instructed the guards in ancient. He claimed that prayers and words in languages that were no longer spoken had the ability to ward off evil forces. Once they had gathered everything they needed, the expedition would leave in 2 days. Tension in the community reached nearly intolerable heights during this preparation period. People jumped at the first sound and hardly slept. Even though they didn't fully comprehend what was going on, children sobbed more because they could sense the adults' fear. And at night, when the mountains were covered in darkness, everyone could have sworn they heard that far-off chant once more, emanating from among the trees. 18 men assembled in front of the church the morning before they left. They included farmers, hunters, Reverend Porter himself, who refused to let his parishioners face evil alone, and Henry Wallace, a blacksmith who insisted on going despite being one of the marked. Each man had a shotgun or rifle, sharp knives, and backpacks that held enough food for several days. Daniel Crowley was standing there looking at an old map that he had. Carried a map for years that depicted mountain locations not found on any official charts. Jacob Turner took the initiative and led the group along a path he was familiar with from his early years. Under normal circumstances, walking to the Forbidden Valley would take about 6 hours, but since many areas were still covered in snow and the mountainous terrain was difficult, they anticipated that it would take the entire day. When they set out, the sun was high, but everyone knew they wanted to arrive at their destination prior to dusk. It was too terrifying to even consider the possibility of being there after sunset. The hike was largely uneventful for the first few hours. They crossed streams that were starting to thaw as spring approached, followed well-known paths, and passed well-known landmarks. However, the atmosphere changed more as they moved further north. The trees grew oddly, twisted, and leaned at odd angles as the forest became denser. Sunlight appeared to have trouble getting through. The trees were still bare, but there was a canopy of branches above them. Jacob paused at noon and gestured toward a deep valley in the distance. "That was it," he murmured. The Forbidden Valley was that. Only the upper rim was visible from where they stood. It was a steep, heavily vegetated slope that descended to a location concealed among the mountain peaks. It made no noise, no birdsong, no movement of any animals. It seemed as though every living thing instinctively shunned that location. Daniel examined the landscape, meticulously looking at his map and taking notes in a little notebook. He gave the group instructions to keep quiet, move slowly, and keep an eye out for any indication of human or other presence. There would be sentries, traps, or some kind of alert if this valley was being used for rituals. They had to keep the element of surprise intact. They started down the slope cautiously. The terrain was dangerous, with roots that appeared to have been planted there on purpose to trip people, and loose rocks concealed beneath the snow. Someone Several men needed assistance from their companions after slipping. The process was laborious and slow, and the sense of oppression increased with each meter they descended. The air itself seemed to get heavier and more difficult to breathe. What they discovered when they eventually arrived at the valley floor surpassed their worst fears and validated all the stories. Decades ago, Jacob's father had described it precisely. The circular clearing in the middle where only black, desolate earth grew. The patterns created by the surrounding stone structures, which were partially covered in moss and vines, suggested a purpose but were difficult to interpret. Additionally, the faded but still discernible ancient paintings on the rock walls depicted figures that appeared to be partially human and partially indefinable. However, something else was present that wasn't there during the last visit. A recently built structure, vaguely resembling an altar, stood in the very center of the clearing, made of wood and bones bound together. None of the men would ever forget the sight of the altar in the middle of the clearing. Built of vertical logs pushed into the ground in a circle joined by entwined horizontal branches, it was about 2 meters tall. However, the bones, mostly animal bones that were fastened to the branches with ropes made of plant fiber, and hung so that they swayed slightly with any change in the air, were what really disturbed the structure. Deer skulls, exposed ribs, and tiny bones that might have belonged to foxes or rabbits were all arranged in ways that alluded to a possible ritual purpose. Daniel Crowley walked slowly toward the altar and motioned for the others to hold off. He circled the building, scrutinizing every inch, sometimes stooping to look at marks on the floor. There were obvious signs of recent use on the bare earth of the clearing. The remains of burned candles, fire ashes, and dark stains were all over the ground, along with footprints, many of them moving back and forth in different directions. It could have been animal blood. However, it was the object in the middle of the altar that drew Daniel's attention and held him there. On a level stone surface, 3 items were thoughtfully placed. He instantly recognized them. It was a green woolen shawl, just like the one Sarah McKinley wore the day she vanished. Martha Green must have owned a small silver brooch, the kind worn by elderly women, and a worn leather belt that was exactly like the one Benjamin Foster always wore. The group was rocked by the discovery. This was conclusive evidence. Neither wild animals nor accidents were responsible for the disappearances. These people, or at least their possessions, had been brought to this accursed location by someone. And where were the people if the objects were present? Daniel looked closely at the altar's surroundings, searching for any indications of recent graves that might point to the location of the bodies. Reverend Porter was the one who saw what the others had overlooked. He indicated one, of the rocky walls next to the clearing, where a shadowy aperture was visible, partially obscured by vegetation. At the very least, it was the entrance to a cave. A person could crawl through the cave's narrow, possibly 5-foot-wide mouth, and from the darkness inside came a potent, musty, disagreeable stench that made stomachs turn. A number of men lit torches and lanterns. The Reverend and Jacob Turner went into the cave after Daniel. Some stayed behind to guard the entrance, while others, exploring the clearing further. They had to move hunched over at first because the cavern's interior was small, but after a few meters it opened up into a larger chamber. More of those old paintings and damp walls covered in mineral formations were visible through the lanterns. Because they were shielded from the weather, these were far better preserved. What was on the chamber floor, however, caught everyone's attention. Each of the 3 separate sections was encircled by circles made of something white, like bone dust or chalk. There were no bodies inside the circles, but there were piles of ripped clothes, rusty chains fastened to the rock wall, and bloodstains on the floor. The chains were unfastened, as though the person who had been detained there had been released or removed. Daniel carefully touched the clothing while kneeling next to one of the circles. Based on the description he had heard, he was able to identify the fabric of Sarah's dress. The chains felt warm to the touch, as though they had just been worn. This indicated that someone had visited there recently, possibly just hours or minutes prior to their arrival. Everyone tightened their grip on their weapons as they looked anxiously at the surrounding shadows upon realizing this. There was another, even smaller passage at the rear of the room that appeared to go further into the mountain. Daniel paused in front of it. He was aware that miles of caves could be found in the Appalachians, creating underground mazes where one could get lost indefinitely. Going there without the appropriate equipment, and it would be suicide to know the way. However, they couldn't just leave Sarah, Benjamin, and Martha behind if there was a possibility that they were still alive somewhere farther down that cave system. Only as far as the torchlight could reach was to be explored. Each man carried a weapon in one hand and the long rope in the other as they moved slowly toward the passage's entrance. The tunnel's walls narrowed as it descended at a sharp angle until they were barely able to get through. Their footsteps reverberated in an odd way, returning as warped murmurs that seemed to come from all sides. The tunnel descended for about 50 meters before opening once more, this time into a much larger, natural cavern. The chamber was impressive, stalactites hanging down like the teeth of some enormous creature, its ceiling vanishing into darkness above them. A rock formation that somewhat resembled a throne stood in the middle of this chamber, and surrounding it were additional painted symbols that were obviously recent were created using red paint that was still glowing wet under the torchlight. They discovered the first living individual there. Leaning against the cave wall, Martha Green sat on the rocky floor, staring into space with her eyes open but vacant. She was wearing something different from what she had been wearing when she vanished. A rough, dark, thick fabric tunic of sorts. She was unresponsive when Reverend Porter came up and lightly touched her shoulder. She appeared to be physically, in every other sense, but not in this one. On the other side of the room, Jacob Turner discovered Benjamin Foster in a similar state. The seasoned hunter was sitting cross-legged, rocking slightly from side to side, and muttering unintelligible words in a voice so low it was barely audible. Additionally, his eyes were open but unfocused, and Benjamin remained motionless as a doll when Jacob attempted to lift him without resistance or assistance. Sarah McKinley, however, was not present in the room. They looked behind every door and in every corner. Rock formation, calling her name over and over. She was nowhere to be seen. Concern grew as Daniel examined the symbols on the walls. He told the others that they told a story, a ritual sequence that he had never thought he would see in real life, but had seen mentioned in ancient texts. 3 sacrifices were needed at various points in the ritual. The first 2 were preparation. Their essences gradually evaporated, leaving them in the state of emptiness that befell Martha and Benjamin. The third sacrifice, however, was not the same. It was the complete and irrevocable final offering. There was only one possible explanation if Sarah was the third and she wasn't present. It was the last part of the ritual, and whoever was carrying out these sinister activities would have to return her to the surface, clearing at a certain time in order to finish it. Daniel swiftly reviewed his notes and made calculations based on the moon's phases and the stars' positions. When he understood the solution, his eyes grew wide. That night, during the darkest hours, would be the ideal time. Before the sun comes up. They needed to get back to the surface right away. They had to lay a trap and wait for the person who was behind it all to come forward. If Sarah was still alive, it was their only chance to halt the last ceremony and possibly save her life. With caution, they carried Benjamin and Martha back through the small passageway, ascending slowly to the first chamber before emerging from the cave into the last of the afternoon light. When they came out into the clearing, the sun was just beginning to set. They had very few hours before dusk and a lot of work ahead. Daniel placed the men in key locations throughout the clearing, out of sight of the main altar but concealed by the trees and rocks. No matter what they heard or saw, he told them to be completely still and silent. The element of surprise was essential. They put Martha and Benjamin in a safer, farther off place with 2 men watching over them. They continued to breathe slowly but steadily, while in that catatonic state, unresponsive to stimuli. Daniel said he couldn't promise anything, but if the ritual was halted in time, it might be possible to change their state. Their mental harm might be irreversible. Reverend Porter assembled the men closest to him and led a silent prayer while they waited. He prayed for strength to save those who could still be saved, courage to face what lay ahead, and divine protection. His words were genuine and full of a faith that had been put to the test but not shattered by the horrific events of the previous few weeks. Like a thick blanket, darkness fell over the valley. On that night, without a moon, the stars emerged in the sky unusually bright. The men shivered in their hiding spots as the cold grew stronger. Slowly, the hours went by, and every minute seemed to go on forever. Some started to wonder if they had the correct information, and if anyone would show up. Then they heard it at midnight. Instead of typical footsteps, there was a rhythmic, shuffling sound coming from the direction they had come from. The valley. The guards had heard that low, eerie chant before, but it was closer and clearer now, revealing a complexity of overlapping voices that made their skin crawl. As it got closer, the chant became louder. Syllables that seemed to warp reality around them, words in a language none of them understood. Figures started to appear from the shadows between the trees. 1, 2, and 5 in that order. They were all dressed in dark robes, just like Martha and Benjamin had been wearing when they were found. Simple masks of bark and bone covered their faces, their sharp eye holes glowing in the low light of the torches they carried. They maintained the continuous chant by moving in ceremonial formation and synchronizing their steps. Sarah McKinley was in the middle of the group, being carried by 2 of the masked figures. A tightly tied cloth covered the young woman's mouth, but she was conscious, her eyes wide with fear. She made a feeble effort, but her hands were restrained and her movements were clumsy, as though she had taken a drug. She was carried straight to the altar in the middle of the clearing by the figures, who placed her on the level stone where the missing person's possessions had once been. With their fingers clenched on their gun triggers, the hidden men watched anxiously for Daniel Crowley's signal to take action, but Daniel motioned for them to stand motionless. He had to comprehend the ceremony completely, determine who was in charge, and determine the precise time of susceptibility prior to their attack. Sarah might lose her life in a single rash decision. From the forest came more figures. At least 10 masked people were now gathered around the altar, all of them singing that melancholy song. They started moving in a clockwise circle around the building, their footsteps making a pattern in the desolate ground. One marked the time of the ritual by tapping a long staff adorned with feathers and additional bones on the ground at regular intervals. A ceramic bowl was carried by another, and thick, fragrant smoke rose from it, incense that dizzied onlookers even from a distance. Then another figure came out of the woods. The leader was obviously this one. He was dressed in a more ornate robe that was adorned with painted symbols that gave off an unsettling greenish glow. The mask was more intricate, featuring a full skull of an animal, possibly a wolf, modified and embellished with colored stones and feathers. Everyone fell silent as soon as the tall, authoritative figure raised his hands. The voice, "that," came from behind the mask, and although it was distorted and guttural, it had a familiar quality. Daniel cocked his head in an attempt to locate it. He made a question mark in the direction of Reverend Porter, who was concealed nearby. Even the Reverend had noticed. He recognized the voice, the rhythm, the undertone of the timbre, but where was it coming from? The leader in the mask started talking out loud, using English sporadically but continuing to speak in that unidentified language. It was a call to ancient forces, an invocation, and an offer of trade. He talked about the price that has to be paid, about power that has been granted, and about knowledge that has been forbidden. He claimed that 3 essences had been offered, 3 souls had been promised, and the 3rd would fulfill the agreement made decades prior, an agreement that had helped the community get through its darkest moments. The truth that came out of those words was startling. This was not novel. Perhaps numerous times over the years this ritual had already taken place. Every time a community prospered, every winter was endured while other communities died, every abundant harvest when nearby areas experienced famine. All of this had been purchased with blood, silent sacrifices, and disappearances that were attributed to mishaps or animal attacks. Lives were exchanged for group advantages that were unquestioned. From his tunic, the masked leader removed a long knife, its blade glowing eerily in the torchlight. With both hands still chanting, he lifted it above his head. The other figures raised the volume and urgency of their chanting. Sarah had trouble. More forcefully, but she was securely held against the stone by 2 of the figures. The young woman's eyes were frantically looking for assistance in the surrounding darkness as tears ran down her cheeks. Daniel gave the signal at that precise moment. 18 men came out of their hiding places at once as a sharp whistle pierced the air. Shouts of conflict erupted from the nearby forest, weapons drawn. There was a complete element of surprise. Some of the masked figures let out gasps of surprise as they froze, others attempting to escape right away. With his knife still raised, the leader abruptly turned to face the assailants, changing from a ritualistic to a defensive stance. Reverend Porter ran directly to the altar, moving more quickly than a man of his age should have been able to. The young woman was bound by ropes, which he started to untie after pushing one of the figures holding Sarah to the ground. The masked figures were surrounded by men, including Jacob Turner, who gave them instructions to kneel on the ground and take off their masks. The majority immediately obeyed. Now that their ceremony had been disrupted, the leader was obviously afraid, but he refused to give up. Instead, he turned the knife down in a lethal arc and faced Sarah again. The blade sliced into Reverend Porter's shoulder as he threw himself over the young woman, causing hot blood to spurt out instantly. Despite his agonized screams, he clung to Sarah and protected her with his body. The leader dropped the knife as Michael Hayes and Thomas Whitmore charged in and grabbed him from behind. After a brief altercation, the leader, unexpectedly powerful, but he was quickly overwhelmed and knocked to the ground. Daniel Crowley walked over slowly, grabbed the ornate mask, and removed it. Everyone in the room recoiled in disbelief as the face became visible. It was someone they trusted, someone they knew, and someone who had been with them for years without raising any red flags. The first twig figure discovered in the barn was little Emily's father, John Patterson. He was a devoted churchgoer, one of the most well-liked farmers in the neighborhood, and a man who had supported innumerable neighbors during trying times. Anger and something that looked like despair twisted John's face. When his eyes met Reverend Porter's, they were filled with annoyance at being interrupted rather than regret. His voice was now distinctly recognizable as he started speaking, and the words came out in a bitter torrent. They didn't understand, he said. They had destroyed something vital, and now that the covenant had been broken, the community was doomed. John outlined how he had inherited this knowledge from his father, who had inherited it from his father, in an increasingly forceful voice despite being strapped to the ground. Since the first settlers came to the area, The Patterson family had been the custodians of these customs for many generations. They were the ones who kept the equilibrium, made the required sacrifices to guarantee the community's prosperity, and in exchange, the valley's ancient forces shielded those areas from illnesses, plagues, and natural catastrophes that devastated other areas. He glanced at the other masked figures, their faces now visible. Everyone was a part of the community, some more than others. Henderson, the widow, had always seemed so devout and compassionate. David Walsh, a young merchant who had only been in the area for 5 years, seemed to have been hired right away. They had all taken part, including Margaret Collins, the distant cousin of Reverend Porter. Everyone was aware. All of them had kept the secret. The disclosure of. The men who had come to save Sarah experienced a wave of collective nausea due to the sheer number of participants in the rituals. John Patterson was not the only lone wolf engaging in sinister activities behind closed doors. It played an important role in the community. They raised their children side by side, ate meals together, and prayed together on Sundays. No physical blade could pierce as deeply as the betrayal. Daniel Crowley gave the order to have everyone restrained and guarded while he examined. Sarah, aside from bruises on her wrists where the ropes had been tightened, the young woman appeared to be unharmed despite being in shock and trembling violently. In an attempt to jolt her back to reality, he spoke to her in a soothing, low voice and offered her water from a canteen. She started breathing more regularly and her eyes gradually focused, but the tears still trickled silently down her cheeks. While another man bandaged his shoulder wound, Reverend Porter went straight up to John Patterson. His voice wavered, but not out of fear, deep disappointment combined with righteous rage. He questioned John about how he could look at his own daughter, little Emily, knowing what he had done, and how he could defend the killing of innocent people in the name of blood-based prosperity. John's laugh was a broken, bitter sound. He claimed that the Reverend was unaware of the true nature of the world. The church preached a merciful God, he claimed. But when the settlers starved, where was that mercy? When entire communities were plagued by disease, when the ancient forces of the valley were neither good nor bad, and winters killed families without making a distinction between the two. They were just truthful. They made an offer that was easy to understand and follow. A few lives in return for many lives saved. It was utilitarianism that was brutal but effective, based on simple mathematics. Jacob Turner spat close to John on the ground. According to him, there was no moral equation or rationale that justified those acts. The individuals who had been offered as sacrifices were community members as much as anybody else. They had worthwhile lives with loving families. Placing oneself in God's shoes meant deciding who should perish so that others could thrive. Furthermore, that was not divine. It was demonic. Daniel was more cautiously investigating the area surrounding the altar during this confrontation. Near the base of the building, he discovered a book concealed beneath a cloth. The leather cover was stained and worn, and the pages were yellowed and brittle. He found it when he carefully opened it. It was a journal, or more accurately, a chronicle of the family. Every ritual carried out, every sacrifice made, and every benefit obtained in exchange were recorded in pages and pages written in a variety of handwriting spanning decades. Nearly 50 years ago, in 1772, the first entries were made. It appears that John's great-grandfather, Jeremiah Patterson, wrote them. He explained how he had come upon the valley while exploring, how he had discovered remnants of prehistoric ceremonies, and how he had experimented and developed the ability to connect with the inhabitants of that place. There was a sense of excitement and discovery in the early entries, as if they had discovered some secret knowledge that others had missed. However, the tone shifted as Daniel perused. The entries grew more solemn and calculating. Every sacrifice, its circumstances, its selection, and its carrying out were painstakingly recorded by Jeremiah. He justified each one by highlighting the benefits that would follow for the community, a bountiful harvest following the disappearance of a lone traveler. A gentle. Shortly after 3 orphaned children were brought to the valley, an elderly woman without family was offered protection from an epidemic that ravaged nearby communities. As Daniel read, bile rose in his throat. It persisted across the generations. The terrible information and responsibility were passed down from the father to Jeremiah's son, then to his grandson, and finally to John. Each continues the cycle by contributing their own ideas. The Pattersons weren't the only ones. With time, with the belief that they were making a necessary sacrifice for the greater good, other families had been included in the inner circle, sharing the secret and taking part in the rituals. The preparations for the last ritual that had been halted were detailed on the most recent page, which was written by John himself only a few days prior. He clarified that the agreement was approaching the end of a cycle and that it needed to be renewed every 21 years. The 3 sacrifices made this year were particularly significant because they would signal the start of a fresh cycle that would continue until 1842. The community would be safe and prosperous for another 20 years if it were finished successfully. Now, however, the ceremony had been broken. The 3rd sacrifice was still unfinished, and this indicated that the agreement had been broken, according to the very reasoning documented in that awful journal. On one point, John had been honest. Yes, they had ruined something. Whether this was a long-needed liberation or a true tragedy was the question. Daniel shut the journal and grasped it firmly. This would be important proof of decades of covert crimes in addition to what John and the others had done. Over the years, how many people had vanished? How many families had endured hardships without ever being informed of the truth? He turned to face the bound participants who were now sitting in silence. Some of them had defiant looks on their faces, while others appeared to start realizing the seriousness of what they had done. What to do with them all was the next question. The distance from the main community was more than just a journey, and even farther away from any recognized legal authority. Although there was a sheriff in Greenbrier County, his presence was irregular and his jurisdiction was ambiguous. It would be difficult to bring all those inmates back while Sarah was traumatized and Martha and Benjamin were in a catatonic state. Holding his injured shoulder, Reverend Porter proposed that they stay there until daybreak. Everyone was worn out from the tension of the night, and they needed light to make their way back safely. He suggested that they camp near the edge of the clearing, continuously monitoring the inmates and leaving as soon as the sun came up. They also had to make a decision about what to do with the clearing and this unholy altar. Daniel added a condition to his agreement. They have to demolish the entire ritual structure before departing. The cave would need to be sealed after the altar was burned. The circles were disassembled, and the symbols were as completely removed as possible, sealed to prevent easy access in the future. For too long, this location had been desecrated and utilized for sinister purposes. Generations. It was time to finally close it. The clearing was surrounded by campfires, which provided islands of warmth and light amidst the chilly nighttime darkness. Every 2 hours, half of the men rotated between keeping watch and resting. Sitting close to one of the fires wrapped in blankets, Sarah slowly drank hot tea made with heated water and herbs. Although she hadn't spoken yet, her eyes were more alert and her breathing had slowed. Benjamin and Martha were positioned close to her, still in that state of absence and emptiness. Daniel re-examined them, looking into their pupils and checking their pulses to determine the extent of the damage. He wished that their minds might start to heal with time and attention, away from that accursed location. Whatever the ritual had done to their essences, what they had gone through had left them with deep, possibly permanent wounds. 4 armed men stood watch over John Patterson and the other participants who were still restrained on the other side of the clearing. They sat in solemn silence, no longer protesting or elaborating. A few gazed vacantly into the flames. Others closed their eyes, possibly in prayer or just attempting to ignore the truth of what had transpired and what lay ahead. The atmosphere in the clearing changed slightly as night turned to dawn. As though the earth itself were exhaling in relief, the oppressive weight that had been there ever since they entered the valley appeared to be easing. The men noticed that the sounds of the forest had returned to normal. The rustle of tiny animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, and the whisper of the wind in the trees were sounds that had previously been absent, but now sounded normal rather than menacing. Daniel spoke with Reverend Porter about this. He claimed that the ritual's interruption had broken more than just an agreement between ancient forces and humans. He had started to release the evil energy that had built up over decades in that location. The valley still had the scars of its history, making it an odd place, but it was no longer being used as a gateway to the outside world. Even though a full recovery would take much longer, it was a first step toward healing. The gray pre-dawn light filtered through the twisted trees, slowly bringing dawn to the forbidden valley, revealing the clearing that the darkness had obscured. The altar appeared smaller and less intimidating in the daylight, but it was still unsettling. It was just bones and wood bonded together, but what it stood for was the blood it had seen. Continued to have a strong presence over the years. The men started their destructive work as soon as there was enough light to do so safely. They broke the connections, separated the branches, and removed the bones for distant burial as they methodically dismantled the altar. The wood was heaped high and burned, the smoke swirling into the clear morning sky as the flames rose high. Daniel moved around the clearing while it burned, turning and cutting the ground where the ceremony was performed with a shovel. Circles had been drawn, erasing the designs and blending everything until there were no more signs. The cave was harder to get into. They lacked enough gunpowder to bring the tunnel to a complete collapse. They therefore chose a different strategy. To block the entrance, they rolled large stones, stacked them tightly, and then filled in the spaces with earth and smaller stones. This would make it much more difficult for someone to enter the cave, but it wouldn't render it permanently unreachable. To walk in casually. Reverend Porter also marked the location as something that should stay closed by using his knife to carve a simple cross on top of the pile of stones. They attempted to remove as much of the old paintings as they could from the rock walls that surrounded the clearing. They scraped and covered as much as they could with mud and vegetation, but some were too embedded in the stone to be entirely removed. Although flawed, the work was symbolic. They were attempting to take back this location, restore it to its natural state, and let decades of sinister use gradually fade away. They got ready to depart around mid-morning, once the destruction was finished. Although she still needed 2 men to support her, Sarah was now able to walk. At dawn, she had uttered a few words for the first time, thanking the people who had come to save her in a raspy voice. They used blankets and branches as makeshift stretches to carry Martha and Benjamin. The inmates were chained together in a row, each joined by ropes, creating a line that would make navigating the steep return trail easier. It was a tiring climb out of the valley. The terrain was even more hazardous on the way up than it had been on the way down, particularly when leading prisoners and carrying the injured. They stopped often to rest, adjust loads, and make sure everyone was okay, and it took them nearly twice as long to descend. When they eventually left the Forbidden Valley area and entered the more typical forest where the trees grew, the sun was high in the sky, straight with natural light filtering. On the way back, nobody talked much. Everyone was burdened with an emotional burden, a fatigue that extended beyond physical fatigue. They had learned things about their own society that had completely altered their perspective on everything. How many others had been aware but kept quiet? How many had harbored suspicions but decided to ignore them? With this information, these inmates, and the dark legacy that had come to light, what would they do now? In the middle of the afternoon, they noticed the first homes in the neighborhood. As soon as word got out about their return, locals started to assemble and watch the group emerge from the forest with a mix of horror and relief. Knowing that Martha and Benjamin had been located and that Sarah was still alive brought relief. It was terrifying to see their own friends, neighbors, and trusted individuals among the confined inmates. Emily Patterson was among the first inmates to see her father. While playing in front of her home, the 10-year-old girl was. The procession went by. Her mother ran out of the house, saw the scene, and let out a scream that was a combination of shock, pain, and an indescribable sound as she froze, her eyes widening in bewilderment. She covered Emily's eyes and drew her in close. However, it was too late. She had lost her innocence. That evening, the community came together at the church. Every family was there, standing along the walls, crammed into the pews, and some even gathered at the front door. Reverend Porter, in spite of his shoulder injury and profound fatigue, took the podium. He described everything they had found in a steady, hoarse voice. He didn't mince words or sugarcoat harsh realities. The community needed to be aware of what had transpired in front of them for so many years and comprehend its full scope. The church was completely silent when he was done. Then, gradually, people started to respond. Some sobbed, shattering the quiet. Others cast suspicious glances around. Pondering how many others were aware of it but had concealed it, anger was present, expressed in voices that rose up calling for justice and the most severe punishment possible for those found guilty. Surprisingly, some people also stood up for John Patterson and the others, claiming that they had taken the appropriate steps to safeguard the community. This final response led to contentious debates. When someone attempted to defend the sacrifices, Thomas Whitmore got up and confronted them. He reminded them that his life had been viewed as less valuable and that he had been marked for death. More valuable than the prosperity of the group. He questioned whether they would agree with this reasoning if they or their kids were selected to be sacrificed. Where did they draw the line between monstrosity and survival, he asked. Jacob Turner went on to say that there was no concrete proof that the rites had brought about the wealth John claimed. Appalachian communities had to deal with severe winters, unpredictable harvests, and sporadic illness. Depending on hard work, luck, and preparation, some people survived while others did not. Work, not on sinister alliances with ethereal powers. By attributing all achievements to sacrifices, one was erroneously interpreting correlation as causation and identifying patterns where only chance existed. Daniel Crowley shared his viewpoint after being asked to speak as an outsider with knowledge of these customs. He clarified that during his travels, he had observed numerous communities that blamed supernatural forces for their good or bad luck. Occasionally, these beliefs were merely consoling superstitions. However, when they resulted in human sacrifice, they crossed a line that no civilized society could tolerate by purposefully hurting innocent people. Killing innocent people was always and everywhere wrong, regardless of how long-standing the custom was or how sincerely one believed it. Hours passed during the debate. It was evident that the community was sharply divided. They disagreed on how to move forward rather than necessarily defending the rituals. As summary justice for heinous crimes, some wanted to put John Patterson and the others to death right away. Others contended that they ought to be brought to the county. Sheriff, you were tried in accordance with the law, and a tiny but vocal minority said that instead of ruining more lives by making everything public, maybe everyone should just try to forget and move on. Reverend Porter was the one who eventually established order. He stated that he could not and would not permit summary murders to take place in his capacity as the community's spiritual leader. Until the sheriff could be called to come get them, John and the others would be detained under the watchful eye of reliable men. An appropriate trial would take place. Evidence would be presented, and witnesses would be questioned. As a community that aspired to be just and civilized, this was the least they owed the victims. The Reverend announced that the diary, the gory book that detailed decades of crimes, would be given to the police as proof. However, he also recommended that the community start its own documentation process, documenting all recent events, discoveries, and testimonies. He hoped that if this case went to trial, they would require all conceivable pieces of evidence. Life in the community continued in a sort of surreal suspension during the next few days while they waited for the sheriff who had been dispatched to pick them up. While people went about their daily lives, tension, whispered conversations, and suspicious looks were all around them. Families connected to the inmates were shunned. Even though many felt sorry for Emily Patterson and her mother, who were innocent victims of Jay's actions, they were particularly alone. Sarah McKinley gradually started to recuperate with the unwavering support of her neighbors and family, who offered her soup, herbal teas, and encouraging words. Every night, she continued to have nightmares in which she would wake up and scream as she saw the altar, the masks, and the knife approaching her. Before Sarah was able to go back to sleep, her mother slept next to her, holding her hand through the night while muttering lullabies and prayers. She sat by the window during the day, gazing off into space at the far-off mountains, as though she was still processing what had happened. Benjamin Foster and Martha Green offered a distinct and unsettling recuperation. Although they had recovered from that initial state of catatonia, they had not fully reverted to their previous characteristics. Martha started talking, but she frequently spoke incoherently, hopping from one subject to another without making any sense. She mentioned people who weren't there, described locations that no one knew, and sometimes went into episodes where she appeared to be reliving events from her time spent in the cave. Benjamin was quieter, but the keenness that had once marked the seasoned hunter was gone from his eyes. He appeared to have forgotten many of the skills he had once mastered flawlessly, moved slowly, and needed continual instruction for basic tasks. During this waiting period, Daniel Crowley stayed in the community and studied the two survivors in an attempt to determine the precise effects of the ritual. He searched his notes and books for references to comparable customs in other cultures and locales. What he discovered was not promising. According to reports of comparable rituals from other regions of the world, victims who made it through the preparatory phases frequently never fully recovered. It was as though a crucial aspect of their identity had been lost or irreversibly damaged. In order to avoid both giving false hope and destroying all hope, he disclosed his findings to the families in private. He claimed that the human mind possessed incredible healing abilities, and that there were documented instances of partial recovery over months or even years when taken out of stressful situations. Benjamin and Martha were safe, alive, and might be able to regain more of themselves with time and attention. However, there was also a chance that these alterations were irreversible, and that the people they had known had changed forever. 7 days after the ritual was disrupted, the sheriff showed up. Weary from the long ride, he was accompanied by a clerk and 2 deputies, all of whom were mounted on horses. William Garrett, a 50-year-old man with a weather-beaten face, served as the sheriff, and eyes that had witnessed a lot in his decades of patrolling this wilderness as a law enforcement officer. His expression grew more serious as he listened to Reverend Porter's story, occasionally asking questions to get clarification on certain points. Sheriff Garrett silently inspected each inmate after being shown around. He asked to see the diary and spent hours reading pages because he knew some of these people and had dealt with them in small legal matters over the years, but he never thought they would be capable of something so horrible. Page after page, his face becoming more serious. If the laws were enforced as strictly as possible, that document alone would have been sufficient proof of several death sentences. Sarah, Martha, and Benjamin were also questioned by the sheriff, though the latter was challenging due to their mental states. Although she lacked specifics about some aspects, Sarah was able to provide a coherent account of her capture, the days she spent trapped in the cave, and the ongoing fear because she was regularly given drugs with, substances that caused her to become disoriented and confused. Even though Martha and Benjamin's memories were fragmentary and hard to piece together into a cohesive story, they nevertheless confirmed some aspects of what had occurred. There were also a lot of interviews with Daniel Crowley. Whether this was an isolated incident or a component of something bigger, the sheriff was interested in the wider ramifications. Daniel clarified that comparable ritual customs, frequently kept under wraps, were practiced throughout Appalachia and beyond, by communities' small groups. The majority were never found. Natural causes are being blamed for the disappearances. The only reason what had transpired in Greenbrier County was unusual was because it had been made public. Sheriff Garrett made his decision public following 3 days of investigation. After being transported to the county seat, John Patterson and the other 9 participants would await a formal trial. Because such cases were uncommon, he was unable to guarantee the date of the trial. Complicated, but he promised to keep them safe until then. Additionally, he made it clear that Sarah, the men who took part in the rescue, and other people with pertinent information would be called upon to testify when the time came. There was tension on the morning of the prisoner's release. The entire neighborhood watched as armed deputies loaded John Patterson and the others onto a makeshift wagon while they remained restrained. While some yelled derogatory remarks, others stayed, solemnly quiet. Emily Patterson watched her father being led away while she stood there holding her mother's hand and shedding silent tears. John gave her a quick glance, his expression too complicated to decipher, before averting his gaze. Since the discovery, Catherine Patterson, John's wife, had been in disbelief. Her husband had always taken care to keep that aspect of his life totally apart from his family, she vowed, and she had no idea what he was up to. A few in the community trusted her. Others were still dubious. How could a wife be unaware that her husband was performing sinister rites and offering human sacrifices? However, Catherine appeared to be truly heartbroken, growing older in a matter of days, and her health was clearly failing as a result of the disclosure and humiliation. The community had to decide how to proceed after the sheriff and the inmates departed. Another church meeting was called by Reverend Porter, but this time the agenda was not about determining guilt, but rather restoration and healing. He spoke about forgiving one another for not seeing, questioning, or protecting the weak among them, not forgiving the crimes that were unforgivable. He discussed the necessity of re-establishing trust in order to build a community that is genuinely founded on the principles of openness and compassion. Despite their sincerity, the words were unable to fully heal the rift that had been created. Some families started talking about moving away and starting over somewhere else where they wouldn't have to. The weight of that troubled history. Others were adamant about staying in order to demonstrate that the community could endure and even prosper without the rituals, proving that John Patterson's initial claim that the pact was essential was untrue. After coming dangerously close to becoming a victim, Thomas Whitmore emerged as a particularly powerful advocate for community change. He suggested creating a community council, an elected body of locals who would convene frequently to deliberate on significant matters and reach decisions, collectively, and guarantee that nothing akin to this can occur in secret again. This council was established in the weeks that followed, with representatives from a number of families who were all dedicated to the values of transparency and responsibility. Daniel Crowley stayed for a few more weeks, providing insights from someone who had researched similar phenomena and assisting the community in processing the trauma. He conducted meetings where participants could voice concerns, ask questions, and relate personal tales of mistrust in the past. That made sense now. Though necessary, these discussions were challenging and frequently emotional. For generations, the atrocities had been permitted by silence. To make sure they would never happen again, the first step was to speak out. Daniel visited the Forbidden Valley one last time before departing. Only Reverend Porter was with them this time. After stopping the ritual that morning, they wanted to see if the changes they had noticed had continued. Their findings were positive, even though decades have passed since the clearing of grim use seemed more typical. In the formerly bare space, patches of grass had started to grow. During their first visit, they had not heard birds singing in the trees around them. There was no indication that anyone had tried to remove the stack of stones above the cave entrance. Daniel remarked that it might take years or even decades for the valley to fully heal. A sort of memory, an energetic imprint that took time to fade, was left in places that had been used for sinister purposes for so long. Disperse. However, the process had already started, and this location might eventually revert to being merely another mountain valley, free from the burdens of its horrific past, and beautiful and natural. The Greenbrier County community underwent significant transformation in the months that followed the sheriff's and the inmates' departure. With the arrival of spring, the last of the snow melted. Fresh mountain water filled the streams, and wild flowers filled the valleys with vivid hues. It seemed as though nature itself was, rejoicing in freedom and a fresh start following a protracted, gloomy winter that had been both real and symbolic. Sarah McKinley's recuperation was progressing slowly but steadily. She had started to engage in family activities once more, talk more, and smile occasionally. She was still having nightmares, but they were happening less frequently, and she was learning coping mechanisms. Months after confiding in her about that strange light in the woods, her younger sister now slept in her bed every night, providing her with quiet solace. Existence. Despite being traumatized, the McKinley family was recovering as a unit and helping one another get through the challenging times. Though they also showed signs of improvement over time, Martha Green and Benjamin Foster remained altered. Martha still experienced periods of confusion, but she also had good days when she could talk nearly normally. In order to make sure she was never left alone, and that someone was always available to gently bring her back to reality when her thoughts strayed, her neighbors had made plans to alternately look after her. Benjamin had recovered. Even though his former mental acuity appeared to be permanently diminished, he was able to regain some of his practical skills and perform basic farm tasks. Instead of lamenting who he had been, his wife discovered a new way to love him, accepting him for who he was now. Travelers and irregular mail brought news of the trial in spurts. Due to its unprecedented scope and character, the case had garnered a great deal of attention in the area. The diary kept by the Patterson family for many generations was regarded as one of the most unsettling evidence that has ever been introduced in a Virginia court. Attorneys from all over the world came to defend the accused, claiming insanity or the impact of uncontrollable forces. Others came to make sure that justice was done. In the early summer of 1821, the trial was finally held. Along with her parents and Reverend Porter, Sarah went to the county seat to testify. Having to publicly relive the atrocities she had gone through and seeing the faces of those who had intended to sacrifice her again was a terrible experience. However, she maintained her composure and spoke clearly as she recounted every detail she could recall. There was not a single dry eye in the courtroom when she concluded her testimony. In their testimonies, Thomas Whitmore, Jacob Turner, and the other men involved in the rescue described the ritual structures, sacrifice evidence, and other items they discovered in the Forbidden Valley. The courtroom was filled with growing horror as the diary itself was read aloud, page after page of recorded confessions. A few of the onlookers, rendered incapable of hearing. Others seemed enthralled with the enormity of the evil that had been exposed. In his own defense, John Patterson was called to testify. Under intense scrutiny, his reasoning broke down, but he insisted that he had done what had to be done, and that the sacrifices were necessary for the community to survive. When asked how he picked his victims, he acknowledged that they were typically lone travelers, people few would miss, or people with fewer family ties. When faced with he had no convincing response to the fact that this was just picking the weak because it was simpler. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found all 10 defendants guilty. Sentences changed according to the degree of participation. John Patterson was given a hanging death sentence because he was the main perpetrator of the rituals and the ringleader. Others were given life sentences. Penalties for some of the less involved participants ranged from 10 to 20 years. Henderson, a widow who had received the lightest punishment of 5 years for participating in just 2 rituals and demonstrating sincere regret. On a soggy July morning, 3 weeks after his trial, John Patterson was put to death. His passing was not celebrated. Instead, there was a somber sense that justice had been done, despite the fact that the harm he had caused could not be undone. Instead of going, his wife Catherine and daughter Emily stayed at home to try to start over and escape the shadows that John had cast over them. In the community of Greenbrier County, life developed a new rhythm gradually. The community council that Thomas had suggested was operating smoothly, holding monthly meetings to talk about matters that impacted everyone. There was open discussion about future paths, openness about decision-making, and a common resolve to never again allow sinister secrets to fester among them. In addition to being a place of worship, the church had evolved into a community hub where people congregated frequently to exchange meals, tales, and encouragement. Daniel Crowley made a second appearance in the curious to see how the community was doing months after the traumatic events in the fall of that year. He was impressed by what he discovered. They were resolute in their resolve to not allow the past to dictate their future. That year's successful harvests weren't due to dark pacts, but rather to diligence, meticulous preparation, and a little weather luck. Nobody had vanished inexplicably. Life continued, flawed but truthful. Before departing, he made one final trip to the Forbidden Valley. The change was amazing. Much of the clearing had been covered by vegetation, concealing the damage caused by the events that had occurred there. Moss covered the pile of stones above the cave entrance, giving the impression that it had been there for centuries. Daniel noticed deer tracks in the soft ground and birds nesting in the nearby trees, animals that had previously completely avoided this area. Perhaps no one would remember what had been done there in time as the valley healed and returned to its natural state. In the years that followed, the neighborhood develop and thrive in ways they never would have thought possible. New families moved in while they were living under the shadow of ritual, attracted by the rich soil and the burgeoning reputation of a friendly, close-knit community. In the end, Sarah McKinley found true happiness, married a young farmer, had kids, and never fully forgot those awful times. Martha Green regained enough clarity to live out her last years with loving neighbors. Benjamin Foster spent his days instructing the students and relearning some of his previous skills, teaching the youth of the community about the forest, albeit in a more straightforward manner than previously. Generation after generation has been told the tale of what transpired in the winter and spring of 1821. It was stated aloud as a reminder rather than being concealed or whispered in private. A reminder that tradition does not excuse cruelty and that evil can lurk behind well-known faces, that wealth derived from other people's misery is fake and corrupt. Yes, it was a tale of horror, but it also showed the bravery of common people who stood up, who made the decision to act morally even in the face of danger, in opposition to something horrible. Emily Patterson carried her father's name with her throughout her childhood. However, the community eventually figured out how to keep the innocent child apart from the man's wrongdoings. She became one of the most vocal advocates for justice and openness, spending her adult life working to protect the weak and make sure that no one was dismissed as less important. She turned the trauma she experienced as a child into a purpose, converted pain into a resolve to make the world a better place. Most people gradually forgot about the valley where so many atrocities had taken place, and it was just another part of the huge Appalachian Mountains. Even now, some elderly people stayed away from that area. They are uncomfortable because of old memories. Younger generations, however, went there fearlessly to hunt, gather medicinal plants, and just take in the beauty of nature. The land, resilient as ever, had absorbed its dark past and moved forward. Few people today, over 2 centuries later, are fully aware of what occurred in Greenbrier County during the winter of 1821. The official records are there, but they are yellowed and seldom consulted in dusty court archives. However, the story's core is still applicable. It serves as a reminder that trust is the foundation of communities, that secrets undermine that trust, and that no prosperity is worth the sacrifice of innocent lives. It also serves as a reminder that we are all capable of both good and evil, and that our identity is shaped by the decisions we make on a daily basis. John Patterson and his supporters opted for a sinister course, justifying brutality as a necessity. However, a lot of people made different decisions, including Reverend Porter, Thomas, Jacob, and Sarah. They opted for justice, truth, and light. The Appalachian Mountains continue to hold many secrets, tales buried in forgotten valleys, truths concealed under centuries of silence, even in the most trying and costly times. Perhaps some people should be buried, but others, like this one, should be told not to frighten or shock, but to educate, warn, and remind us of our common humanity and the obligation we have to each other. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. If this story resonated with you in any way, or if it caused you to consider the sinister mysteries that remain hidden in the shadows of history. For more spooky and inquisitive tales from the forgotten nooks and crannies of American history, subscribe to the channel. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, turn on the notification bell. Additionally, share this video with anyone you know who appreciates true tales about historical mysteries. Each perspective helps us keep bringing these significant stories to light. I appreciate you coming along on this somber trip through the past with me. Until the next tale.